Keep an eye out for the foresight bias. We are lousy at estimating the quality of our learning based on our current performance. As Robert and Elizabeth Bjork have shown, with some research demonstrating that the more confident we are in our retention of an information, the less likely we are to remember it later. This is due to a lack of fluency once again. We have more confidence in things that come to mind quickly, yet we haven't fully processed those fluent information. So, in addition to the stuff you think you know well, test yourself on the subject that may feel unfamiliar on a frequent basis. Desirable problems can help you acquire motor skills, like as playing a musical instrument, in addition to factual learning. The current belief is that music practice should be a disciplined but very repetitive process, in which you spend long sessions practicing the same few bars over and over until you can play them flawlessly. Instead, according to the Bjork's research, it's considerably better to alternate a few different music pieces, spending a few minutes on each one. Each time you return to the exercise or passage, you will be able to refresh your memory. You might also try to introduce some variation into the music's performance. Ellen Langer instructed a group of piano students in her research on conditional learning to alter your style every few minutes and not to lock onto one particular rhythm. Attend to the context while you practice, which could include slight variations or any sentiments, sensations, or thoughts you're thinking. On a subsequent exam, independent judges thought their playing was more proficient than that of kids who had instead practiced in a more traditional fashion, aimed at rote memorization. Langer has since carried out a similar experiment with a huge symphony orchestra, where continuous repetitious practice can lead to burnout. The players' satisfaction improved when they were instructed to seek for minor subtleties in their performance, and their performance was also assessed to be more entertaining by an impartial group of musicians. Although the orchestra may appear to be a totally different atmosphere than a school classroom, the principle of intentionally embracing nuance and complexity in learning can be applied to any situation. Following my meeting with the Bjorks at UCLA, I went to a nearby school in Long Beach, California, that may be the most thorough attempt to implement all of the concepts of evidence-based knowledge in a single institution to date. Jason Beer, a philosophy professor at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles, founded the institution, which is known as the Intellectual Virtues Academy. Beer's research focuses on virtue epistemology, which investigates the philosophical significance of characteristics such as intellectual humility, curiosity, and open-mindedness for excellent reasoning. And he has lately partnered with some of the psychologists who examine intellectual humility. Beer's interest had been entirely theoretical at the time of the IVA's creation, but that changed after a phone call from his friend and fellow philosopher Steve Porter, who had heard a radio news program about the Obama's choice of school for their children. The article mentioned the availability of so-called charter schools, which are state-funded schools that are run privately and follow their own educational philosophy and curriculum. Porter suggested that since the two philosophers both had small children, they might try to start their own charter school. They began meeting in coffee shops on a regular basis to discuss how they might implement a teaching model that intentionally cultivates intellectual virtues such as curiosity, not as an add-on, extracurricular program, but rather where everything is oriented around the question of how we can help our students grow in some of these qualities. Beer explained, "From the time I walk into the building, this image is crystal obvious. The 9 master virtues that the IVA considers essential for successful thinking and learning are written on the walls of every classroom, along with slogans. They are categorized into 3 groups, starting at the beginning. Curiosity is the desire to wonder, reflect, and inquire as to why things are the way they are, a desire to learn and explore. Intellectual humility is defined as a willingness to accept one's intellectual limitations and errors without regard for one's intellectual status or prestige. Intellectual autonomy is defined as the ability to think independently and actively, the ability to reason and think independently. While executed, attentiveness refers to the willingness to be personally present in the learning process. Distracts are kept at bay with this technique. Makes an effort to be present and mindful. Intellectual vigilance, a proclivity for spotting and avoiding intellectual blunders. Assists with precision. Intellectual rigor, a desire to learn and explain things thoroughly. Unsatisfied with superficiality or simple solutions. Inquires into the meaning and comprehension of things at a deeper level. Problem solving, ability to think outside the box, is referred to as open-mindedness. Competing viewpoints are given a fair and open hearing. Intellectual courage is the willingness to think or communicate despite fear, such as fear of embarrassment or failure. Intellectual tenacity is defined as a willingness to take on intellectual difficulty and struggle. Keeps its eyes on the prize and isn't easily discouraged. As you can see, some of these virtues, such as intellectual humility, open-mindedness, and curiosity, are the same elements of good thinking that Igor Grossman included in his early studies of wise reasoning about everyday events. All others, such as intellectual carefulness and intellectual thoroughness, are more closely linked to the cultivation of skepticism that we discussed in Chapter 6. Intellectual courage, intellectual tenacity. Whether or not you agree with the IVA's educational philosophy, that's a pretty good checklist for the mental qualities that people need to avoid falling into the intelligence trap. With a weekly advisory session led by teachers and parents, the children are explicitly taught about these concepts. During my visit, for example, the advisory sessions focused on effective listening, with the kids encouraged to think about how they communicate with others. They were asked to think about the advantages of virtues like intellectual humility and curiosity in conversation, as well as the situations where they might be inappropriate. The class finished up by listening to an episode of the This American Life podcast about a young girl named Rosie who struggled to communicate with her workaholic father, a physicist. A relatable exercise in perspective taking. The goal is for the kids to become more analytical and reflective about their own thinking as a result of all of this. The virtues are also taught in traditional academic subjects, in addition to these explicit lessons. Following the advisory session, for example, I went to a Carrie Noble-led 7th grade lesson for students aged 12 to 13. The students were learning how to calculate the interior angles of a polygon, and rather than being taught the principles directly, the class had to work through the logic of coming up with the formula on their own, a strategy that reminded me a lot of Stigler's accounts of the Japanese classroom. Later, I observed an English class discussing music appreciation, which included a TED Talk by conductor Benjamin Zander, in which he discusses his own difficulties learning the piano, reinforcing the notion that intellectual struggle is necessary for progress. Throughout the day, the teachers modeled the virtues by admitting their own ignorance if they didn't know an answer right away, an expression of intellectual humility, or admitting their own curiosity if something piqued their interest in a different direction. Such subtle signals can really prime a child's own thinking, as Dweck, Engel, and Langer have all shown. I only spent one day at the school, but based on my conversations with the faculty, I got the impression that the school's strategy is based on solid psychological research to ensure that more sophisticated reasoning is incorporated into every subject while maintaining academic rigor. Students couldn't practice intellectual qualities until they were up against a tough and sophisticated curriculum. The principal, Jackie Bryant, told me, without the writing and feedback, we won't be able to determine the depth of their comprehension. They're a match made in heaven. In comparison to the average adolescent, the children's metacognition, their knowledge of potential thinking errors and ability to remedy them, look to be extremely advanced. Their parents appear to be quite taken aback. It's fantastic. A lot of us don't learn this until we're adults, if at all. Natasha Hunter, one of the parent advisors, said me during the advice lecture. Hunter, who also teaches at a nearby college, was impressed by the children's advanced reasoning at such a young age. At this level, I believe critical thinking is required, because they don't think at the level we need them to think when they come to me after a public school education. Academic achievements of students are self-evident. Eva was rated one of the top 3 schools in the Long Beach Unified School District in its first year of operation. In a statewide academic success test for the 2016 to 17 school year, moreover 70% of its students met the required English requirements, compared to a statewide average of 50%. We must be cautious about extrapolating too much from this achievement. Many of the psychologists I've spoken with point out that encouraging successful, broad educational reform can be tough. Eva is only one school with a highly motivated staff who are all dedicated to upholding its goal. Nonetheless, the Eva gave me a glimpse of how Western education could begin to nurture the other thinking modes that are so crucial for efficient reasoning in adult life, resulting in a whole new generation of wiser thinkers. Part 4. The crowd's wisdom and folly. How teams and organizations can avoid falling into the intelligence trap. 9. How to assemble a dream squad. Iceland should not have qualified for the Euro 2016 men's football tournament. According to the majority of experts, they had been ranked 131st in the world just 4 years before. How could they possibly aspire to compete in the championships as one of the top 24 teams? The first shock came in the qualifying rounds in 2014 and 2015, when they upset the Netherlands to become the smallest country to ever qualify for the World Championships. And in the first round, they were held to a surprising draw by Portugal at the Stade de Saint-Étienne. Cristiano Ronaldo, Portugal's best player, was irritated by their surprise triumph and complained about the methods. He told reporters after the game it was a lucky night for them when they don't try to play and instead focus on defending. This, in my opinion, demonstrates a small mentality and indicates that they will not compete. The Icelanders, on the other hand, were unafraid. They drew their next match with Hungary and won 2-1 against Austria. Commentators predicted that the tiny country's good fortune would run out shortly. They accomplished it again, this time against England, a side comprised virtually entirely of players from the top 20 finest football teams in the world. The final goal struck the UK's TV analysts dumbfounded. The match was hailed as one of England's greatest humiliating defeats in history by The Guardian. Iceland's dream came to an end when they were eliminated in the quarterfinals by the host team. But football critics all around the world were stunned by their achievement. Iceland's very existence at the championships came against all odds. Kim Wall, one of Time's sports writers, put it, a nation, a volcanic island surrounded by year-round glaciers, has the world's shortest soccer season. Even the designer field grass at the National Stadium, hand-picked to endure Arctic winds and snow, periodically froze to death. And with a population of 330,000 people, they had a lesser pool of potential players than many London boroughs. One of their coaches was still a dentist part-time. They were, in many people's opinion, the genuine heroes of the tournament. Not Portugal, the eventual champion. Iceland stayed around 20 in the international rankings at the time of writing in 2018 and had become the smallest country ever to qualify for the World Cup. Contrary to Ronaldo's critiques, their accomplishment was not a fluke after all. How had this tiny country beaten teams comprised of some of the sport's biggest players, despite being a country with a population more than 100 times its own? Is it feasible that their surprise success was a result of, rather than a result of, their lack of star players? Sports history is littered with unexpected turns of events. A miracle on ice, when a team of American college students defeated the Soviet hockey team at the 1980 Winter Olympics, is perhaps the most memorable upset of all. Argentina's surprising gold medal in basketball at the 2004 Olympics, where they crushed the USA, the heavy favorites, was more recent. The underdogs in each case had less experienced players, but their total talent was more than the sum of their parts. However, in terms of the challenge's sheer chutzpah, and the teamwork that allowed them to punch so much above their weight, the success of Iceland is possibly the most instructive. Sporting ability is considerably different from the kind of intelligence we've been looking at so far, but the lessons learned from such surprising accomplishments could be applied beyond the football field. Many businesses hire extremely intelligent, qualified employees with the expectation that they will immediately combine their brainpower to generate miraculous results. However, for whatever reason, such organizations frequently fail to capitalize on their abilities, exhibiting poor innovation, inefficiency, and occasionally unnecessarily dangerous decision-making. We've seen how higher intellect and skill may occasionally backfire for individuals in the previous 8 chapters, but the same concerns can also afflict teams, as certain attributes appreciated in high-performing people might harm the group as a whole. In a team, there is such a thing as too much talent. This is a multi-brain intelligence trap. And the same factors that helped Iceland beat England can also help us comprehend workplace politics in any organization. Let us first analyze some more general intuitions about group thinking before focusing on the dynamics that connect the England football team to the corporate boardroom. The wisdom of the crowd, the idea that multiple brains working together may correct for each other's faults and judgments. We make each other better, has been a popular concept. An examination of scientific journal publications reveals that collaborative efforts are considerably more likely to be acknowledged and applied than single-author papers. Conversations and the exchange of ideas, contrary to popular belief, bring out the best in team members. Their combined brainpower allows them to see connections that were previously invisible. However, there are numerous well-known examples of team thought that has failed miserably, often at tremendous cost. Opponents frequently invoke the phenomena of groupthink, which was first explicitly documented by Yale University psychologist Irving Janis. He was inspired by the 1961 Bay of Pigs catastrophe to investigate the reasons for the Kennedy administration's decision to attack Cuba. He came to the conclusion that Kennedy's advisors were too eager to create a consensus and too fearful of criticizing one another's judgments. Instead, they exacerbated one another's motivated reasoning by reinforcing their existing prejudices. Once the desire to conform had blinded their judgment, the intelligence of the individuals didn't matter much. Francis Galton, Charles Darwin's cousin, likewise made an argument for the wisdom of the crowds. He asked passers-by at a county fair to estimate the weight of an ox for an article published in Nature Journal in 1907. The median estimate was 198 pounds, which was only 9 pounds or 0.8% from the real weight. Furthermore, more than half of the estimates were within 4% of the genuine number on either side. Building on this discovery, several commentators have suggested that obtaining a group consensus is often the greatest approach to improve the accuracy of our judgments, and that hiring as many bright people as possible will almost certainly ensure higher success. Skeptics of collective thinking may refer to the numerous instances in which groups fail to agree on any solution at all, resulting in a deadlock, where they may overcomplicate a problem by including all points of view. A stalemate is the polar opposite of more rigid groupthink, but it can still be detrimental to a team's productivity. Design by committee should be avoided. The most recent research helps us reconcile all of these points of view by providing some ingenious new tools for determining if a group of bright people can tap into their combined abilities or succumb to groupthink. Anita Williams-Woolley has been in the vanguard of these new discoveries, having developed a collective intelligence test that promises to revolutionize our understanding of group dynamics. She was doing the current set of research in her lab at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh when I met her. It took a Herculean effort to create the test. One of the most difficult tasks was creating a test that captured the complete spectrum of thinking that a group must engage in. Brainstorming, for example, necessitates a type of divergent thinking that is significantly different from the restricted, critical thinking required to reach a decision. Her team eventually settled on a 5-hour battery of exercises that combined to assess 4 different types of thinking, creating new ideas, selecting a solution based on solid judgment, bargaining to find a compromise, and general job execution competence, such as coordinating movements and activities. Many of the exercises, unlike those on an individual IQ test, were practical in character. For example, in a bargaining skill test, the groups had to envision themselves as housemates sharing a car on a trip into town, each with a shopping list, and they had to organize their trip to acquire the best deals with the least amount of driving time. Meanwhile, the subjects acted as jurors in a moral reasoning test, expressing how they would assess a basketball player who bribed his instructor to assess their overall performance. Each team member was seated in front of a separate computer and asked to enter words into a shared online document, a deceptively simple task that tested how well they could coordinate their activities to avoid repeating words or writing over each other's contributions. The participants were also asked to complete certain verbal or abstract reasoning activities that would normally be included in an IQ test, but they were asked to respond as a group rather than individually. The first intriguing discovery was that each team's performance on one of the constituent tasks was connected to its performance on the others. In other words, it looked that some teams consistently performed better than others due to an underlying element, similar to the mental energy that is supposed to be represented in our general intelligence. Importantly, and in accordance with most of the previous research on individual creativity, decision-making, and learning, the success of a group proved to be only marginally related to the members' average IQ, which could explain just 2.25% of the variation in collective intelligence. It couldn't be linked to the group's highest IQ. The teams didn't just rely on the smartest person in the team to do all the thinking. Willie's team has validated its test in a variety of scenarios since publishing it in Science in 2010, demonstrating that it can predict the success of a variety of real-world undertakings. Some of them were within walking distance of my house. They looked at students in a university management course who were conducting a 2-month group assignment. The team's performance on numerous assignments was indeed predicted by the collective intelligence score. Surprisingly, teams with higher collective intelligence continued to improve throughout the project. They were not only better at the start, but they also progressed the most during the 8 weeks. Uli has used her exam in the Army, a bank, computer programming teams, and a huge financial services firm, which had one of the lowest collective intelligence scores she had ever seen. She was not contacted again, which could be a sign of their faulty groupthink. However, the test is more than just a diagnostic tool. Willie has also been able to look into the fundamental reasons why some teams have better or lower collective intelligence, as well as how such dynamics might be altered. Social sensitivity of team members is one of the strongest and most constant predictors. Willie used a classic measure of emotional perception in which participants are shown photos of an actor's eyes and asked to guess what emotion that person is supposed to be feeling: happy, sad, angry, or scared, with the average score strongly predicting how well they would perform on the group tasks. Surprisingly, the same factors might influence the fate of teams who collaborate online. They can read between the lines of direct messages and better coordinate their actions even if they aren't meeting face to face. Willie has looked at the specific interactions that might raise or degrade a team's thinking, in addition to the reading the thoughts in the eyes exam. When a company lacks a hierarchy, for example, companies may value someone who is prepared to take leadership, the type of person who considers themselves a natural leader. When Willie's team looked at how often each member spoke, They discovered that the best groups enable everyone to contribute equally, whereas the worst groups are controlled by just one or two people. Those who are more dominant don't have to be overbearing or disrespectful, but if they give the appearance that they already know everything, other team members will feel they have nothing to add, depriving the group of valuable knowledge and alternate viewpoints. Unbridled zeal can be a liability. The most damaging dynamic, according to Woolley, is when team members begin competing against one another. This was the issue with the financial services firm's corporate culture as a whole. Each year, the corporation would only advance a certain number of people based on their performance reports, making each employee feel threatened by the others and causing group work to degrade. Woolley's research has sparked a lot of attention since she originally released her findings because of its insights into misogyny in the workplace. Many commentators have remarked in recent years how aggravating it is for certain guys to mansplain, interrupt, and appropriate women's ideas. These are the kinds of behaviors that hinder group performance by closing down a conversation and discouraging women from expressing their knowledge. Indeed, Woolley has demonstrated that teams with a higher number of women have higher collective intelligence, and that this can be linked to their higher general social sensitivity when compared to groups with a higher proportion of men, at least in her tests in the United States. When Woolley tested the collective intelligence of online teams playing the League of Legends computer game, when the player's gender was obscured by their avatar, it wasn't just that the men acted differently when they knew a woman was present. It wasn't just that the men acted differently when they knew a woman was present. The specific cause of these gender variances is unknown. There may be a biological basis for certain differences in social sensitivity. Testosterone has documented impacts on behavior, and higher amounts make people more impulsive and domineering, for example. But other differences in social sensitivity could also be learned culturally. According to Woolley, these findings have already swayed public perception. Some companies have simply turned what we've discovered into recruiting more women. Whether or not you would modify the gender balance based on these findings, hiring people of both sexes with higher social awareness is an obvious method to improve an organization's collective intelligence. The label we give to social intelligence, soft skills, frequently implies that it is a weaker, secondary equivalent to other types of intelligence, and the tests we use to investigate interpersonal dynamics, such as the Myers-Briggs Type Inventory, are poor predictors of actual behavior. If you're looking to hire a smart team, Woolley's research clearly implies that these social skills should be a top priority, and that we should start using scientifically validated metrics to assess this trait, just as we do with cognitive capacity. Woolley's experiments begin to explain why certain groups of clever people fail by demonstrating that collective intelligence has such a weak association with IQ. But given the findings on the individual intelligence trap, I was also curious if high-performing teams are ever at a larger danger of failing than teams with lower abilities. Intuitively, we would assume that extremely clever or powerful people will have difficulty getting along due to the overconfidence or closed-mindedness that comes with their position, and that this will harm their overall effectiveness. Are these feelings, however, justified? Cornell University's Angus Hildreth has some solutions for us. His research was sparked by his work at a worldwide consulting firm, where he was frequently in charge of meetings involving some of the company's top executives. They were highly effective people who got to where they were because they were good at what they did. But when they got together in these group circumstances, I was amazed at the dysfunction and challenges they experienced. He told me during one of his numerous trips back to London. I was anticipating this platonic ideal of leadership. You gather all of the best individuals in a room, and something good will inevitably happen. However, there was a lack of ability to make choices. We were consistently behind schedule. Returning to the University of California, Berkeley, to pursue a PhD in organizational behavior, he decided to investigate the phenomenon further. He collected executives from a multinational healthcare business, divided them into groups, and instructed them to think they were hiring a new chief financial officer from a pool of dummy candidates in one experiment published in 2016. However, the distribution of power across the groups was not equal. Some were made up of high-flying executives who oversaw large teams, while others were largely made up of their subordinates. To make sure he wasn't merely witnessing the consequences of existing executive competition, he made sure the executives in the groups had never worked together before. Alternatively, there could be a history of someone beating someone else to a job, despite their qualifications and experience. High-flying groups frequently failed to establish a consensus. 64% of high-power teams reached a stalemate, compared to only 15% of low-power teams. This is a four-fold gap in group effectiveness. One issue was status conflict, in which high-ranking members were more concerned with expressing their authority in the group and selecting who would be the top dog than with the task at hand. The high-flying teams, on the other hand, were less inclined to share information and incorporate each other's points of view, making it considerably more difficult to reach an agreement. You could argue that in order to succeed in the first place, you need more confidence. Perhaps these people have always been a little more self-serving. However, a subsequent lab experiment with students revealed that sending someone on such an ego trip requires surprisingly little effort. The pupils' initial job was straightforward. They were divided into couples and instructed to construct a tower out of building blocks. Each couple was told, ostensibly based on their responses to a questionnaire, that one was a leader and the other was a follower. It didn't matter if they succeeded or failed at the assignment. Hildreth's purpose was to instill a sense of power in some of the participants. In the next exercise, he divided the students into 3 groups, either all leaders or all followers, and gave them some creative challenges, such as establishing a new company and developing a business plan. Former leaders, high on the sliver of power conferred in the prior exercise, were less cooperative and found it difficult to exchange information and agree on a solution, lowering the group's overall performance. In other words, they were showing the kind of mutually sabotaging behaviors that Woolley had discovered to be so damaging to a team's collective intelligence. When Hildreth saw the groups at work, he believes the power battles were obvious. He told me they were very frigid interactions. At least one kid in the group withdrew quite frequently, either because the relationships were so unpleasant, or because they didn't want to join in the discourse since their thoughts weren't being heard. And the one who makes the judgments, and my decisions are the best, they reasoned. Despite the fact that Hildreth's study focused on a single healthcare organization, other field investigations imply that these dynamics are widespread. For example, a study of behavior in teams across the firm's hierarchies in Dutch telecoms and financial institutions found that the further up the company you go, the higher the level of conflict reported by employees. This, however, appeared to be contingent on the members' own perceptions of their own places in the pecking order. They were more productive because they avoided frequent jockeying for authority if the team, as a whole, agreed on their relative positions. The worst groupings were made up of high-status individuals who had no idea where they were in the hierarchy. A study of Star Equities analysts in Wall Street banks provides the most striking example of these power plays, and the clearest proof that too much talent can be counterproductive. Institutional Investor recognizes the top analysts in each industry every year, giving them a type of rock star status among their peers that can lead to millions of dollars in increased earnings. They are also frequently chosen as television pundits. Needless to say, talented individuals frequently cluster at the same famous firms, but this does not always result in the benefits that the company had hoped for. Horace Groisberg of Harvard Business School examined 5 years of data from across the industry and discovered that teams with more star players indeed performed better, but only up to a point. after which the benefits of extra star talent waned. And with institutional investors' picks taking up more than half of the research department, the research department becomes less effective. When the stars' areas of competence coincided, placing them in direct competition with one another, the groups appeared to be particularly fragile, but it was less of an issue when they fell into distinct sectors, putting them in less direct competition with one another. The corporation could then afford to hire a few more superstars, up to 70% of the workforce, before their ruthless egos ruined the team's performance. Hildreth's theory is based on the powerful's interactions in groups, but in addition to disrupting communication and cooperation, status conflict can also impair the brain's ability to process information. Individual members can be a little bit more foolish as a result of their interactions, at least for the period of the meeting. A study, which took place at Virginia Tech, assembled small groups of people and assigned them abstract challenges, while simultaneously broadcasting their progress in relation to the other team members on their computer interface. Some of the candidates became paralyzed as a result of the feedback, resulting in lower marks than in a previous test. Despite having about similar IQs at the start, the participants soon split into two groups, with certain individuals appearing to be particularly sensitive to the competition. The reduced brain power was also visible in fMRI scans taken at the time of the test. It appeared to be linked to increased brain activity in the amygdala, a deep in the brain almond-shaped bundle of neurons associated with emotional processing, and decreased activity in the prefrontal cortices behind the forehead, which are linked to problem solving. The researchers came to the conclusion that we can't isolate our cognitive talents from our social environment. Our ability to utilize our brain power is always influenced by our impressions of individuals around us. Given these findings, it's simple to understand how the presence of a talented but arrogant team member could harm both the collective and individual intelligence of his or her more sensitive coworkers, resulting in a double whammy that lowers their overall productivity. You may joke about how committee meetings make you feel brain dead, but our data imply that they may make you act brain dead as well, says Reed Montague, one of the researchers. Although the sports field may appear to be a vast cry from the boardroom, many sports share the same characteristics. Consider the early 2010 seconds fate of the Miami Heat basketball team. The team was loaded with natural talent after signing LeBron James, Chris Bosh, and Dwayne Wade, the Big Three, yet they finished the 2010-11 season ranked 29th out of 30 teams. They wouldn't win an NBA championship until the following year, after Bosh and Wade were forced to retire due to injuries. Less skill became more, as sports writer Bill Simmons phrased it. To see if this was a common occurrence, social psychologist Adam Galinski looked at the performance of football, soccer teams in the 2010 and 2014 World Cups in South Africa and Brazil, respectively. They determined how many of the country's best talent were now employed by one of the top 30 highest earning clubs in the Deloitte Football Money League, which includes Real Madrid, FC Barcelona, and Manchester United. The value was then compared to the country's qualifying round ranking. Galinski's team discovered a curvilinear relationship, similar to what Groisberg noticed with Wall Street analysts. A team profited from having a few stars, but the balance tended to tip at roughly 60%, after which the club's performance worsened. The Dutch football squad provided an excellent example. Following unsatisfactory results at the Euro 2012 championships, coach Louis van Gaal reshuffled the lineup, cutting the percentage of elite talent from 73% to 43%. It was a bold decision, but it appears that Galinski and his co-authors accurately assessed the dynamics. The Netherlands did not lose a single game in the 2014 World Cup qualifying rounds, according to Galinski, and his co-authors. Ilinsky then used the same idea to basketball rankings, looking at the 10 NBA seasons from 2002 to 2012 to test the too much talent effect in a different setting. They utilized a technique called estimated wins added, which utilizes game statistics to determine whether a team member was frequently a deciding factor in the outcome of a match. Ilinsky's team judged that the top talent was in the top third of these rankings, an admittedly arbitrary cutoff point, but one that many organizations utilize to determine extraordinary performance. Importantly, several of the players in their rating were selected for the NBA's own All-Star event, implying that it was a reliable indicator of top quality. The researchers calculated the percentage of star players in each club and compared it to the team's overall wins over the course of each season. The pattern was almost comparable to the World Cup results in football. When the team did their last experiment, they looked at data from Major League Baseball, which doesn't require a lot of coordination between the people who play. Too much talent did not show up in this study, which supports the idea that status is only bad when we need to work together and bring out the best in each other. The best way to get the best players for sports that aren't as interdependent as basketball or football is to buy them all. It is clear when we look back at Iceland's victory over England in the Euro 2016 football championships that it came from a lot of different things. The country had spent years improving its training programs. Lars Lagerbäck, a Swedish coach, and Heimir Hallgrímsson, a Swedish assistant, were in charge of the team, and they did a great job. The quality of each player was undoubtedly better than it had ever been. And even though many of them worked for international football teams, only one of them at the time, Gylfi Sigurdsson, had a contract with one of the top 30 clubs in Deloitte's Football Money League at the time. Until now, the people hadn't had the kind of international power that could be so bad for them. England, on the other hand, had pulled 21 of its 23 players from these super rich teams, meaning they made up more than 90% of the squad, far above the ideal level. My own calculations show that no team that made it to the quarterfinals had as many star players. Germany came in second with 74% of the stars. England's loss to Iceland at the Allianz Riviera Stadium in Nice is almost like Ilinsky's model, but not quite. Even though they may not have known about Ilinsky's scientific work, football pundits noticed how bad the team dynamics were at the time of the World Cup. It was after Iceland won that Ian Herbert wrote in The Independent, "England, for all their individual skills, lacked so much as one. Because of their egos, many of these players don't make the country feel empathy or connect with them to put on a good show against one of Europe's smallest football teams. They were too well known, important, rich, and powerful. That's what this country is like." Only 4 of Portugal's players came from the top clubs in the Deloitte Money League, by chance. When Ilinsky said that he didn't like teams that had Cristiano Ronaldo on them, the team didn't meet that standard. A miracle on ice from the 1980 Winter Olympics in Lake Placid, New York, shows the same thing. When the Soviet team won gold in each of the last 4 Olympic Games, they set a new record. They had won 27 of their 29 games. 8 of their players had played in at least some of those Olympic Games and also played for high-profile teams in their home country, so they were well known. There were a lot of college kids on the US team, with an average age of 21, which made them the youngest team in the whole tournament. They also had very little international experience, making them the youngest team. That's what the coach, Herb Brooks, knew. It was not David against the giant, as some people thought. Yet, David won. America beat the Soviet Union 4-3, and they went into the second round of medals with Finland. They won the gold medal. You don't have to be an international superstar for this kind of dynamic to apply to you and your coworkers. As Hildreth found with his university experiments, elite performance is in part based on how you think your abilities compare to those of your coworkers. A woman who told me about Ilinsky's research even saw it in her son's amateur soccer team. They had a great team last year and won the state cup. and they brought in a lot of good players from other teams, which made them less fun to play with. 5 games have gone against them now. Our understanding of collective intelligence and the too much talent effect has gotten a lot better. And now we're very close to being able to find simple ways to improve any team. Before we can do that, though, we need to learn more about what a leader does and how the best leaders do it. There was a tragedy on the slopes of Everest. Tunney came out of it. On May 9, 1996, 2 expeditions were ready to leave from Camp IV on the South Khal route in Nepal. They were at an altitude of 26 feet at the time. It was Rob Hall, a New Zealander who was 35 years old. He led the team from Adventure Consultants. They were joined by a group from Mountain Madness, led by a man who was 40 years old. Each team had a leader, 2 other guides, 8 clients, and a lot of Sherpas. Their skills were unquestionable. Hall had already made it to the top of the mountain 4 times before, and he had helped 39 people get there. He was known for being very organized. Before this, Fisher had only been able to climb Everest once. He had already climbed many of the world's most difficult mountains and earned his stripes, and he was sure of the way he would do things. We know how to get to the top of the Biggie. We've built a yellow brick road to get there. One of the survivors, John Krakauer, said Fisher said, in spite of the fact that they worked for different companies, Hall and Fisher decided to work together on the final bid, but they were soon hit with delays and difficulties. One of their Sherpas didn't put up a fixed line to help them get up the mountain, which added an hour to their journey. As they waited for the line to be put up, a bottleneck of climbers formed down the slope. A lot of people wouldn't be able to reach the top and come back before dark. Only a few of them changed their minds, but the majority of them, including Hall and Fisher, kept going. It turned out to be a bad idea. There was a lot of snow at 15, and by 17:30 it was a full-blown storm. Hall, Fisher, and 3 of their team members died when they fell down the mountain. Because the weather was getting worse, they decided to keep going up to the top even though it was dangerous. Fisher himself had talked about the 2 o'clock rule before. If they didn't reach the summit by 2 p.m., they had to turn around so that they could be sure they were back at camp by night. Yet they kept going until they died. A Harvard Business School professor, Michael Roberto, has looked at the accounts of the disaster, including a best-selling book by John Krakauer. He thinks that the team's decisions may have been influenced by the well-known cognitive biases, such as the sunk cost error, which the climbers had each invested $70,000 in the attempt and wasted weeks of effort, and overconfidence on the part of Hall and Fisher. It was more interesting to us, however, to look at the group dynamics, and in particular the hierarchy that Hall and Fisher had set up around them. We have already looked at some of the reasons why a hierarchy might be good for a group, like how it could stop people from fighting about their status and make them work together. In this case, however, the hierarchy didn't work out. After Hall and Fisher, there were more junior guides and local Sherpas who knew the peak well and could have helped them correct their mistakes. But the group didn't feel like they could talk about their problems. This is how Krakauer sees it. Clients were afraid to question the guides, and guides were afraid to question Hall and Fisher, who were in charge. Later, one of the more junior guides, Neil Badelman, said, "I was definitely the 3rd guide, so I tried not to be too pushy. So I didn't always speak up when I should have. And now I'm sorry." Anatoly Baukriv, another guide, was also afraid to say that the team hadn't gotten used to the thin air. I tried not to be argumentative, and instead chose to downplay my intuitions. This is what I did. A quote from Krakauer. Hall had made his own feelings on the hierarchy very clear before they left. "I will not tolerate any dissension up there. My word will be the only law that can't be changed." In the end, Lou Kasishk, one of the team members who had decided to turn back, agreed with the plan. "People need to be honest with each other," he told PBS. On an expedition, he said, "The leader needs to know what his or her team thinks." But Hall didn't listen to them. Relationship. Rob didn't want us to say these things because he didn't want us to. Then, a hierarchy can be both good and bad. so it can be both good and bad. In this case, Adam Galinski looked at records from 5,104 Himalayan expeditions and found that the same thing holds true. He couldn't talk to all the climbers, so he looked at cultural differences in how people think about authority. Some people think it's important to be respectful of other people's positions in a group, while others think it's okay to question and challenge your superiors. People from China, Iran, and Thailand, for example, tend to be more respectful of authority than people from the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, or Norway, according to one widely used measure. People from the United States, Australia, and the UK are somewhere in the middle. Team members from countries where hierarchy is respected were more likely to reach the top of Everest. According to Galinski, this supports the idea that a hierarchy boosts productivity and makes it easier for team members to work together. And more important, they were also more likely to lose team members in the process. Galinski and his team looked at data from more than 1,000 solo trips to make sure they weren't measuring other things that might have influenced their chances of success, such as individual determination. Now, they found that there were no big differences between the different cultures. It was the way they worked together as a group that made all the difference. It's possible that the same thing is at work in many business failures. Some of the people in charge at a company like Enron had a kind of respect for the people above them. And if they didn't agree or had doubts, they were seen as betraying the company. To stay alive, they said, you had to keep drinking the water from Enron. If team members know where they fit in the pecking order, the overall group's performance will be better. This is true only if the team members themselves feel that their opinions are important and that they can challenge their leaders when problems arise or bad decisions are made. Whether you're at a football game in St. Etienne, on Wall Street, or on the slopes of Mount Everest, there are some things that happen in groups that make them work together and make them smart. This new research appears to have captured the forces that make people work together in any situation, in the same way that our understanding of the individual intelligence trap gives us simple ways to avoid making mistakes. This research also gives us ways to avoid the most common mistakes in group reasoning. Research by Woolley and Galinski can help us change how we look for new team members and how we hire them. In light of the too much talent effect, it might be tempting to say that you should stop picking people who are very good, especially if your team already has a lot of star players. At this point, it's probably best not to get too worked up about that number. A specific ratio will almost certainly depend on the personalities in the group and how much cooperation is required. That the scientific research at least suggests that we should pay more attention to interpersonal skills that will help the team's collective intelligence, even if that means letting someone who scores far better on more standard measures of ability go. Emotional awareness and communication skills could also be judged. Do they draw people out and listen, or do they have a tendency to interrupt and dominate? If your team is made up of people from different countries, you might also look for someone who has a lot of cultural intelligence, which we talked about in Chapter 1. They would be able to better navigate the different social norms. As a result, we can also improve the way your talent works together. It was Hildreth's previous job at a global consulting firm that he came up with ways to avoid the clash of egos with other people. In one example, he says, "It's important to point out each person's skills and why they came to the meeting. This helps everyone share relevant experiences. It can get a little lost in the midst of a fight." Hildreth also says that everyone should have a set amount of time to speak at the start of the meeting. The subject of the discussion doesn't have to be related to the problem at hand, but this practice makes each person feel like he or she has already made a contribution to the group's work, which helps to ease the conversation that follows. Hildreth, there is a lot more equality in the discussion so that everyone can speak up. When you get to the point where you have to make a decision, he says that you should set out a clear plan for how and when you will make the decision. For example, he says that you should decide whether the decision will be made by unanimous or majority vote. Finally, And most importantly, the leader should show that he or she is the kind of person he or she wants in his or her team. This means that the leader should show that he or she is willing to have disagreements. In this area, research on group thinking is closest to the new science of evidence-based wisdom. Organizational psychologists are becoming more and more aware that the intellectual humility of a leader not only improves their own decision-making, but also has a positive effect on their closest coworkers as well. Amy Yu, a researcher at the National University of Singapore, looked at the top management teams of 105 technology companies through questionnaires filled out by employees. She found that people who work for a humble leader are more likely to share information, collaborate in times of stress, and help build a shared vision. By relying on the collective wisdom of other people, these businesses were better able to deal with problems and uncertainty, which led to bigger annual profits a year later. Who says that CEOs aren't always on the same page when it comes to humility. Many think that being humble can hurt their team's confidence and them as leaders. This was true even in China, where she had hoped to see more respect for people who were humble. In fact, when she talks to CEOs who are well known, they don't like the word humility. She said, "There are people who think that being humble will make it hard for me to run my team well. It turns out, though, that it does work." History has many examples of these dynamics at work. If you think Abraham Lincoln won the Civil War because he could listen to the people in his cabinet who didn't like him, you're right. Barack Obama's leadership style is said to have been influenced by this, too. Yun-Kyu Choi, the head of consumer banking at Standard Chartered Bank in China, gives us one example of humility at the top in the modern world as well. Before he took the job, top executives thought they would get the red carpet treatment when they visited individual branches. One of Yun-Kyu's first moves was to make each meeting more casual. Employees would get together for huddles where they would talk about how the business could be better and give him ideas. He would show up without telling anyone. He soon found that these meetings were the source of some of the company's best ideas. There were some suggestions that he'd like to make. One of them was to make the bank work on the weekends, so that it would be more like other businesses in the area. It took a few months, but soon they were making more money from those few hours than they had made in all of their work. With every employee able to help the bank's strategy, the whole service was changed, and customer satisfaction rose by more than 50% in 2 years. Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google, also thinks that the only job of a leader is to let other people succeed. Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur. Leadership is less about trying to be successful and more about making sure you have good people, and your job is to remove that barrier, remove roadblocks for them so that they can be successful in what they do. He said in a speech, when a leader is humble, it can help their sports team. This is what one study found. The best high school basketball teams were those whose coaches thought of themselves as servants, not leaders. The best high school basketball teams were those whose coaches thought of themselves as leaders. Under the more humble coaches, the team was more determined, better able to deal with failure, and won more games each season. This is how it worked. The coach's humility made everyone work a little harder and help each other out. Consider John Wooden, who is thought to be the best college basketball coach of all time. 10 national championships were won by UCLA under his leadership over the course of 12 years. Between 1971 and 1974, the team went undefeated for 88 games. After his team won a lot of games, Wooden would help clean the locker room after every game. This made it clear that he was not above the players on his team. Many times, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Wooden's former player and longtime friend, wrote about how he was always humble, even when he had difficult talks with his players. If coach took what one of his players said seriously, he'd be forced to fix things up and teach us all a lesson in humility at the same time. This is how it worked out. Wooden made it clear that everyone could learn from each other, even him. As a result, the team went from strength to strength. Many commentators said that Heimir Hallgrimsson, one of the team's 2 coaches, was very down to earth. Even though he was in charge of the national team, he still worked part-time as a dentist. He seemed to be very interested in listening and understanding other people's points of view. And he tried to teach that to all of his players. For a country like ours, team building is important because we can only beat the big teams if we work together. In our team, we have players like Gylfi Sigurdsson, who is probably our most well-known player. But he is also the hardest worker on the field, who can be lazy if that person works the most. As with other parts of evidence-based wisdom, the study of collective intelligence is still very new. By applying these principles, you can help your team play a little more like Iceland and a little less like England, which will help each person bring out the best in the people around them. 10. Spread like wildfire. Disasters happen, and how to stop them. In the middle of the ocean, we are on a huge oil rig. It's a peaceful evening with a light breeze. Drilling is done by the team of engineers. They are now trying to fill in and seal their well with cement. It looks like everything is going well. They have checked the pressure at the seal, and everything looks good. As soon as possible, the money will start coming in. It should be time for a party. That's not true. The cement hasn't set, and the well's bottom seal isn't strong. They are happy to be done with their work, but oil and gas are starting to build up inside the pipe. It's rising quickly. During the engineer's party, mud and oil start spilling on the rig floor. The crew can taste the gas on their tongues. A blowout will happen if they don't act quickly. There will be an enormous explosion and the biggest oil spill ever. If you know anything about the world news from 2010, you may think you know what will happen next, but this doesn't happen. A leak may be far enough away from the engine room, or the wind is blowing, which moves the air and keeps the gas from catching light. Or maybe the team on the ground notices that there is a lot of pressure and is able to put the blowout preventer in place before it gets too bad. Regardless of what happened, a disaster is not caused. There are a few days of extraction lost, but no one dies. This is not a hypothetical scenario or a wishful picture of the past. It is real. Even in the 20 years before the Deepwater Horizon spill, there had been a lot of small leaks in the Gulf of Mexico because of random things like the direction and speed of the wind. Full-blown disasters never happened, and the oil companies could keep their damage under control. Transocean, the company in charge of cementing the Deepwater Horizon rig, had even had a very similar accident in the North Sea just 4 months earlier. The engineers misunderstood a series of negative pressure tests and didn't notice that the well's seal had been broken. Even though the damage had been done, they were able to stop it before an explosion happened, which meant that only a few days' worth of work were lost. Not a huge environmental disaster. As a result, there was no wind on April 20th, 2010, and the team couldn't stop the oil and gas from spilling. Were you there? Share your story with us in the comments below or on our Facebook and Twitter pages. The rest of it is history. A lot of oil was spilled into the Gulf of Mexico over the next few months, making it the worst environmental disaster in American history. 11 workers died, and the oil spill was the worst in American history. BP had to pay out more than $65 billion in damages to people who were hurt by the oil spill. Why would so many people not notice so many signs? Employees didn't seem to know that there was a chance of a disaster, from near misses to a failed pressure reading on the day of the explosion. A lawyer for a U.S. presidential commission that was looking into the disaster said the well was still flowing. A lot of hydrocarbons were leaking, but for some reason, the crew decided after 3 hours that night that it was a good thing to do. People who have been on a lot of rigs before aren't sure why they thought this was a good test. It was not one of these men's goal to die. Disasters like the Deepwater Horizon explosion require us to look beyond groups and teams to the surprising ways that certain corporate cultures can amplify individual thinking errors and keep us from making better decisions. It almost looks like the whole organization has a collective bias blind spot, which makes it hard to see things that aren't true. In many of the worst man-made disasters in recent history, the same things happen again and again. For example, NASA's Columbia disaster and the Concorde crash in 2000 were both caused by the same things. You don't have to be the CEO of a multinational company to benefit from this research. It has eye-opening findings for anyone who works. People who worry that their work environment is stifling their minds might find this information useful. It also gives advice on how to avoid mindlessly copying the mistakes of people who are around you, so that you don't make the same mistakes, as a way to get ready to talk about disasters. Let's start with a look at functional stupidity in general. There are two people who came up with the idea: Mats Alvesson from Lund University in Sweden and Andre Spicer from the Cass Business School in London. They came up with the term to explain why some companies try to stop their employees from thinking. During his PhD at the University of Melbourne, Spicer worked at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, where he studied how people make decisions. Spicer told me that his interest comes from that time. ABC. They would start these crazy change management programs, which would often do nothing but make people very nervous. Many people at the company knew that the way the company made decisions was not perfect. He told me, "You found a lot of very smart people together in an organization, and many of them would complain about how stupid the organization was." As far as he was concerned, he was shocked by how many people didn't see how pointless their actions were. These very skilled and knowledgeable people were getting sucked into these crazy things and saying, "This is smart, this is rational," then wasting a lot of time. As culture, the same can also be seen in the BBC's offices, which the TV show W1A makes fun of. In the course of researching this book, I worked for the BBC. It occurred to me that making a 3-series sitcom about your own organizational flaws, rather than fixing them, is perhaps the definition of functional stupidity. Years later, he and Alvesson would talk about these problems at a formal academic dinner. A pair of researchers looked at a lot of other examples of organizational stupidity, from the military to at analysts, newspaper publishers, and their own universities. They wanted to see if many institutions use their staff's brains to their fullest potential, or if they just waste them. They came to a very sad conclusion. They wrote in their book, The Stupidity Paradox, "Our governments spend billions trying to make the world a better place. Our businesses boast about their superior intelligence, and people spend decades of their lives building up good CVs. And many organizations we looked at didn't seem to show all of their collective wisdom at all. Though, in fact, many of our most well-known organizations have become stupid engines." Stupidity is a form of narrow thinking that doesn't have 3 important qualities: reflection about basic assumptions, curiosity about the purpose of your actions, and an awareness of the wider, long-term consequences of your actions. Employees aren't being encouraged to think for a lot of different reasons. A lot of the time, people say that this stupidity is useful because it can have some benefits. People may want to go with the flow at work to save time and stress, especially if we know there will be rewards or even a promotion for us later. If you have to compete for money in a psychological experiment, you might choose not to know how your decisions affect other people. This is called strategic ignorance. People who stay in the dark have more moral wiggle room, which means they can act in a more selfish way. We might also be swayed by social pressure. No one likes a troublemaker, after all, who keeps meetings from running on and on with endless questions. If we don't want to share our thoughts, we can stay quiet and nod along with the people around us, even if that means temporarily turning off our critical abilities. This kind of narrow-minded, unquestioning approach can also help the organization in the short term. It can help the organization be more productive and efficient without the employees wasting time questioning the wisdom of their actions. The result is that some companies may, either by accident or on purpose, encourage functional stupidity in their workplaces. Spicer and Alvesson say that many work practices and structures can make an organization functionally stupid, including too much specialization and splitting up tasks. A human resources manager may now have to do just one thing, like set up personality tests. As psychological research shows us, our decision-making and creativity improve when we hear from other people and draw connections between different areas of interest. If we mine the same vein over and over, we may not pay as much attention to the nuances and details that make our work unique. When someone is a fatuidiot, they are a one-track expert who doesn't think outside the box when it comes to a complex problem. When you work for a company, you have to be completely loyal, and you have to focus on the positive all the time. If you say something negative, you might think that's a betrayal, and admitting that you're disappointed or nervous is bad. Spicer told me that relentless optimism is now a part of many business cultures, from small startups to huge multinationals. He talked about research on entrepreneurs, for example, who often say that they will fail forward or fail early, fail often. The growth mindset is a way of thinking that should make you more likely to succeed in the future. Spicer says that entrepreneurs often blame their failures on outside factors like my idea was ahead of its time, instead of looking at their own mistakes and how they could be fixed. They aren't really thinking about how they will grow as people. Between 75% and 90% of new business owners fail at their first ventures, but because they try to stay positive and upbeat, they don't notice their mistakes. Instead of getting better, as this fail-forward idea would say, they get worse over time. Spicer said, because of these self-serving biases, they just start a new business and make the same mistakes over and over again, and they think this is a good thing. The same thing happens in bigger and more well-known businesses, where bosses tell their employees to only bring them good news. As another example, you might be told that no idea is a bad idea. Spicer says that this isn't a good idea. Spicer says that when we take criticism into account early on in a discussion, we are more likely to come up with new ideas. Because you've tried to put together ideas to cover up any differences, you can act on the assumptions instead of trying to push them together to hide them. I hope you will now understand the intelligence trap well enough to see immediately some of the dangers of this myopic approach. The lack of curiosity and insight is particularly damaging during times of uncertainty. For example, Alvison says that rigid and unquestioning thinking kept newspapers from looking into how factors like the economy or rising taxes were affecting their sales. Editors were so focused on looking at specific headlines that they didn't even think about new ways to get their stories out into the world. That Nokia's implosion in the early 2010 seconds offers the most vivid illustration. Soft the ways that functional stupidity can drive an outwardly successful organization to failure. If you owned a cell phone in the early 2000 seconds, chances are that it was made. SBY, the Finnish company. In 2007, they had about half of the world's market. When they came out with their phones 6 years later, most of their customers had switched from the clunky Nokia interface to more sophisticated phones, like the Apple iPhone. A lot of people thought at the time that Nokia was a bad company because it didn't have as much talent or innovation as Apple, that the company didn't see the iPhone coming, or that they were lazy and thought that their own products would be better than any other. In fact, Timo Vuori and Kui Hai found that none of this was true when they looked into the company's demise. All of Nokia's engineers were very good at their jobs. They knew that there were risks ahead. In an interview, even the CEO himself said that he was afraid of all the other companies. It still wasn't enough for them. One of the biggest problems was that Nokia's operating system, Symbian, was not as good as Apple's iOS and didn't work well with touchscreen apps. Overhauling the software would take years, and the management wanted to show off their new products quickly, so they pushed through projects that needed more planning. Unfortunately, employees were not permitted to raise any reservations about the company's direction. If you told a senior manager anything they didn't want to hear, They would frequently yell at the top of their lungs. You risked losing your job if you raised a doubt. One middle management informed the researchers, if you were too negative, it would be your head on the block. Another explained, the idea was that if you criticize what's being done, you're not truly dedicated to it. As a result, staff began to pretend to be experts rather than recognizing their lack of understanding of the issues they were dealing with. And they accepted timetables they knew would be difficult to meet. They'd even tamper with the data that showed their results in order to provide a better image. When employees left, the corporation purposefully selected replacements with a can-do attitude. People who would nod along with new demands rather than challenge the status quo. External consultants were also ignored, with one claiming that Nokia has always been the most arrogant business ever towards my colleagues. It lost any prospect of seeing things from a different perspective. Nokia was finding it increasingly difficult to keep up with the competition due to the very measures aimed to focus employees' attention and encourage a more innovative perspective. As a result, Nokia continuously failed to upgrade its operating system to an appropriate level, and the quality of its products worsened over time. Most staff had secretly lost faith by the time the company released the N8, their final try at an iPhone killer in 2010. It was a flop, and Nokia's mobile phone division was acquired by Microsoft in 2013 following more losses. Rather than psychological experiments, the concept of functional stupidity is based on extensive observational studies, including an analysis of Nokia's demise. However, this type of corporate behavior has clear parallels with psychologists' work on disrationalia, wise reasoning, and critical thinking. For example, you may recall that feelings of threat prompt so-called HOT, self-serving cognition, which drives us to support our own positions rather than seek information that contradicts them, and this lowers scores of sensible thinking. It's why, even if we can't see the answer to our own problems, we're wiser when advising a buddy about a relationship problem. Nokia as an organization, led by its uncompromising top management, was thus beginning to act like an individual confronted with uncertain circumstances, whose ego had been endangered. Nokia's earlier triumphs, on the other hand, may have instilled in it a sense of earned dogmatism, meaning that executives were less receptive to outside advice. Various social psychology research imply that this is a recurrent pattern. Threatened groups become more conformist, single-minded, and inward-oriented. As more individuals embrace the same viewpoints, they learn to prefer simple communications to complicated, nuanced concepts. This may be seen at the national level as well. When a country gets involved in an international crisis, for example, newspaper editorials within that country tend to become more simple and repetitious. No company can completely control its external environment. Some hazards are unavoidable. However, by fostering alternate points of view and actively pursuing disconfirming facts, organizations can change how they communicate those perceived hazards to employees. It's not enough to assume that hiring the smartest individuals possible would result in greater results. You also need to establish an environment that allows them to put their skills to work. Even companies that appear to defy these trends may nonetheless include some evidence-based thinking, even if it isn't immediately apparent from their public image. Netflix, for example, is known for its tagline, "Adequate performance earns a handsome severance," a seemingly cutthroat mindset that may foster myopia and short-term rewards over long-term resilience. However, they appear to counteract this with additional measures that are consistent with other psychological research. Many of the elements of good reasoning that we've discussed so far, such as the need to recognize ambiguity and uncertainty, and to challenge prevailing opinions, are emphasized in a widely circulated presentation outlining Netflix's corporate vision, which is exactly the kind of culture that should encourage wise decision-making. Of course, We can't predict how Netflix will do in the future, but based on its track record, it appears that you can prevent functional ignorance while running a lean, some might say cutthroat, business. The dangers of functional incompetence don't stop with these company failures. Failure to foster reflection and internal input can also lead to human catastrophe, as NASA's disasters demonstrate. Often, it leads to a series of little errors, where the concentrates on the wrong problems and overlooks a situation where a post-mortem should have been conducted. Spicer observes. As a result, an organization may appear to be successful on the surface, while progressively sinking towards disaster. Consider the Space Shuttle Columbia catastrophe in 2003, which occurred when foam insulation from an external tank broke off during launch and struck the orbiter's left wing. A hole that resulted led the shuttle to disintegrate upon re-entry into Earth's atmosphere, killing all 7 crew members. It would have been awful enough if the accident had been a one-time occurrence with no warning indications. However, NASA experts had known for a long time that the insulation could fail in this fashion. It had happened on every prior mission. However, for a variety of reasons, the damage had never occurred in the precise spot to cause a crash. So NASA officials continued to overlook the threat. It evolved from being an unpleasant occurrence for engineers and managers to being labeled as a housekeeping matter, said Catherine Tinsley, a management professor at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., who has specialized in researching business disasters. Interestingly, comparable mechanisms were also responsible for the Challenger disaster in 1986. When a defective seal degraded over the cold Florida winter and exploded. Following reports revealed that the seals had cracked on numerous previous voyages, but rather than taking this as a warning, the crew had grown to believe that everything would be fine. When playing Russian roulette, the fact that the first shot got off safely is little consolation for the next, said Richard Feynman, a member of the Presidential Commission examining the catastrophe. NASA, on the other hand, did not appear to have taken those lessons to heart. Tinsley emphasizes that this is not a criticism of the engineers and managers in question. These are very smart folks that work with data and are putting in a lot of effort to perform a good job. However, NASA's mistakes highlight how quickly your risk assessment can vary dramatically without you even realizing it. The organization was completely unconcerned about the risk of calamity. The reason appears to be outcome bias, a type of cognitive miserliness that causes us to focus on the actual effects of a decision without considering the alternative outcomes. It's really a lack of imagination, like so many other cognitive flaws that afflict otherwise intelligent people. We passively accept the most salient detail from an event, what actually happened, and don't stop to consider what might have happened if the initial circumstances had been slightly different. Tinsley has now conducted numerous trials proving that outcome bias is a regular occurrence among a wide range of professionals. In one study, business students, NASA workers, and space industry contractors were asked to evaluate mission controller Chris, who was in command of an unmanned spacecraft in 3 situations. In the first, the spacecraft launches flawlessly and according to plan. It has a significant design error in the second, but thanks to a stroke of luck, its alignment to the sun, it can still make accurate measurements. The third, on the other hand, has no such luck, and it absolutely fails. Surprisingly, the complete failure receives the worst criticism, while the majority of the participants were content to overlook the design issue and the near-miss scenario in favor of praising Chris's leadership abilities. Importantly, and in line with Tinsley's theory that outcome bias might explain disasters like the Columbia tragedy, the participants' sense of future threats decreased after reading about the near-miss, indicating how certain organizations may gradually develop resistant to failure. Tinsley has since discovered that this proclivity to overlook mistakes was a prevalent element in a slew of other disasters. Every calamity and company problem we analyzed was preceded and anticipated by multiple near misses, Tinsley's team stated in a Harvard Business Review essay in 2011. Take, for example, one of Toyota's most infamous mishaps. A California family of 4 died in August 2009 when the accelerator pedal on their Lexus jammed, causing the driver to lose control on the highway and crash into an embankment at 120 miles per hour, causing the car to burst into flames. Toyota had to recall over 6 million vehicles. A disaster that could have been avoided if the company had paid attention to more than 2,000 reports of accelerator malfunction over the previous decades, which is roughly 5 times the number of complaints that a car manufacturer would normally receive for this issue. Toyota, for example, established a high-level task force to deal with quality control in 2005, but the corporation disbanded the group in early 2009. Arguing that quality was part of the company's DNA, and hence didn't require a dedicated committee to enforce it. While focusing on rapid business growth, senior management also turned a deaf ear to specific concerns from more junior executives. This appeared to be a symptom of a more insular manner of working that didn't welcome outside opinion, and relied solely on individuals at the very top of the hierarchy to make crucial choices. Like Nokia's management, it appears that they just did not want to hear bad news that would divert their attention away from their larger objectives. The long-term cost to Toyota's brand was larger than any savings they hoped to achieve by ignoring these warnings. By 2010, 31% of Americans thought Toyota vehicles were dangerous, a precipitous decline for a corporation long known for the quality of its products and client satisfaction. Consider flying from Paris to New York City on Air France Flight 4590. The Concorde airplane ran over some sharp debris left on the runway as it prepared to take off on July 25, 2000, causing a 4.5 kilograms chunk of tire to fly into the bottom of the aircraft's wing. The fuel tank was punctured as a result of the resultant shockwave, causing it to catch light during takeoff. The plane collided with a nearby hotel, killing a total of 113 people. Following further investigation, it was discovered that the Concorde tire had ruptured on the runway 57 times before, and in one of them, the damage was substantially identical to that of Flight 4590, with the exception that the leaking fuel had failed to ignite due to sheer chance. Nonetheless, these near misses were not seen as major red flags requiring immediate action. These are dramatic case studies in high-risk industries. But Tinsley contends that the same thinking processes will pose hidden threats to many other businesses. She cites data on workplace safety, which shows that for every 1,000 near misses, 1 serious injury or fatality occurs, as well as at least 10 minor injuries. Tinsley does not label her work as functional stupidity, but the outcome bias appears to stem from the same lack of reflection and curiosity that Spicer and Alvison have identified. Even little adjustments to a company's environment might enhance the likelihood of near misses being detected. Tinsley has discovered that when safety is emphasized as part of the corporate culture, in purpose statements, and in lab tests, employees are considerably more likely to notice and report near misses, sometimes by as much as a 5-fold increase in reporting. Consider one of the scenarios in which a NASA manager is preparing for an unmanned space mission. Participants who were told that NASA, which pushes the boundaries of knowledge, must operate in a high-risk, risk-tolerant environment, 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 must operate into those who were told that NASA, as a highly visible institution, must function in a high-safety, safety-first environment. On the other hand, were able to detect the hidden threat. The same was true when the participants were told they would have to defend their decision in front of the board. A near miss then appears to be more of a failing state. Remember, we're talking about unconscious biases here. None of the participants had calculated the odds and decided the near miss was worth ignoring. They simply didn't think about it unless pushed. Some businesses may assume that the benefit of safety is self-evident, but Tinsley's research shows that it must be made a priority. For the most of the decade preceding up to the Columbia catastrophe, NASA's motto was faster, better, cheaper. Before we wrap up our discussion, Tinsley emphasizes that some hazards are unavoidable. The danger comes when we are unaware of them. She recalls a NASA engineer raising his hand in disgust during a seminar. "Do you want us to take any chances?" he inquired. "Space missions are perilous by definition, and I told them that I wasn't here to tell them what their risk tolerance should be. I'm here to tell you that if you have a near miss, your risk tolerance will improve without you even realizing it. No organization can afford that blind hole, as the Challenger and Columbia missions demonstrated. It's all too simple to see how Deepwater Horizon became a hotbed of irrationality prior to the disaster in retrospect. It was 6 weeks behind schedule at the time of the explosion, with the delay costing $1 million a day, and some employees were unhappy with the pressure they were under. Engineer Brian Morrill described it as a nightmare, that has everyone all over the place in an email sent 6 days before the launch. These are precisely the kinds of high-stress situations that have been shown to inhibit contemplation and critical thinking. As a result, many Deepwater Horizon employees, from BP and its partners, Halliburton and Transocean, were oblivious to the impending calamity, which led to a series of egregious blunders. To save money, they elected to secure the well with a cheaper mix of cement rather than researching the likelihood that it wasn't sturdy enough for the job. They also cut back on the total amount of cement used, contravening their own specifications, and on the essential equipment to keep the well in place. The team skipped doing the full battery of tests to ensure the seal was safe on the day of the accident, as well as dismissing abnormal data that could have forecast the buildup of pressure inside the well. Worse, the equipment required to contain the blowout once it had occurred was in poor condition. Each of these risk indicators could have been discovered long before the accident. As we've shown, there were numerous minor blowouts that should have served as substantial signals of the underlying dangers, prompting the implementation of new and updated safety protocols. However, due to fortunate circumstances, including the wind's random direction, none had proven fatal, and the underlying causes, such as extreme corner cutting and insufficient safety training, had not been investigated. And the more they messed with fate, the more they were lulled into a false feeling of security and became less concerned about cutting costs. Tinsley described a clear incidence of outcome bias, and the error appeared to be widespread throughout the oil business. Another oil and gas firm, PTT, had experienced a blowout and leak in the Timor Sea off the coast of Australia 8 months prior. Halliburton, which had also worked on the Macondo well, was also responsible for the cement job. And while a subsequent report claimed that Halliburton bore little responsibility, the incident served as a stark reminder of the risks involved. The lessons were mainly overlooked by the Deepwater Horizon team due to a lack of communication between operators and experts. As a result, we can see that the crisis wasn't caused by the conduct of a single employee, but by an endemic lack of thought, participation, and critical thinking among project decision makers who failed to evaluate the full ramifications of their actions. It is the underlying unconscious mind that governs the activities of a company and its workers, according to a paper from the University of California, Berkeley's Center for Catastrophic Risk Management, CCRM. These failings appear to be firmly founded in a multi-decade history of organizational dysfunction and short-sightedness. According to the report, the management, in particular, had become so fixated on achieving even greater success that they had forgotten both their own frailties and the weaknesses of the technology they were employing. They'd forgotten to be terrified, as they put it. Often, when organizations hunt for the flaws that led something awful to happen, they look for someone to name blame, and then train or get rid of. Carlene Roberts, the head of the CCRM, told me in an interview that it's unusual that the accident was triggered by what transpired on the spot. It's frequently what happened years ago. How can an institution become aware of hidden threats if this unconscious mind represents an organizational intelligence trap? In addition to disasters, Roberts' team has looked at the common structures and behaviors of high-reliability organizations, such as nuclear power plants, aircraft carriers, and air traffic control systems, which operate with a great deal of uncertainty and risk, but have extremely low failure rates. Their findings, like those of functional stupidity theories, emphasize the importance of contemplation, questioning, and long-term implications, such as rules that allow employees permission to think. Carl Weick and Kathleen Sutcliffe have reduced these findings to a set of key qualities that all high-reliability organizations share. Preoccupation with failure. The organization is satisfied with its success, and employees believe that every day will be a bad day. Employees who self-report errors are rewarded by the company. Employees who question assumptions and are critical of established wisdom are rewarded for their reluctance to simplify views. Or engineers in management at Deepwater Horizon, for example, may have expressed alarm about the cement's poor quality and requested additional tests. Team members continue to communicate and engage in order to update their grasp of the current situation and hunt for the fundamental causes of anomalies. Instead of accepting the first explanation, the rig crew on the Deepwater Horizon should have been more curious about the anomalous pressure tests. Resilience commitment, regular pre-mortems, and regular talks of near misses are all part of developing the required knowledge and resources to bounce back after an error. Long before the Deepwater Horizon disaster, BP could have looked into the underlying organizational reasons that led to prior, less significant mishaps, and made sure that all team members were sufficiently equipped to handle a blowout. Respect for expertise. This pertains to the significance of communication between hierarchy tiers and the intellectual humility of those at the top. Executives must have faith in those on the ground. Toyota and NASA, for example, failed to listen to engineers' concerns. Similarly, after the Deepwater Horizon explosion, the media reported that BP employees were afraid to raise concerns for fear of being fired. Small actions that let workers know their dedication to safety is valued can demonstrate a commitment to resilience. On the Carl Vinson, a crew member reported that he had misplaced a tool on deck that could have been sucked into a jet engine. Rather than being punished for his carelessness, the team member was praised for his honesty in a formal ceremony the following day. The message was clear. Faults would be tolerated if they were reported, which meant that the team as a whole would be less inclined to miss minor errors. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy has implemented the SUBSAFE system to reduce nuclear submarine accidents, following the loss of the Thresher in 1963, which flooded due to a faulty joint in its pumping system, killing 112 Navy personnel and 17 civilians. The system was implemented. SUBSAFE particularly instructs officers to feel chronic unease, which is summed up in the phrase trust, but verify, and they haven't lost a single submarine utilizing the technique in more than 5 decades. Weick refers to these combined features as collective mindfulness, a term he coined after reading Ellen Langer's work. The core notion is that the organization should take any steps that encourage its employees to be more alert, proactive, open to new ideas, skeptical of all possibilities, and committed to discovering and learning from mistakes, rather than merely repeating the same behaviors. There is strong evidence that implementing this strategy can result in significant gains. Healthcare has seen some of the most prominent triumphs with communal mindfulness. We've already seen how doctors are influencing people's thinking, but this is more about the wider culture and group reasoning. The available measures include encouraging senior staff to actively engage the ideas of those beneath them, as well as empowering younger staff to question assumptions and be more critical of the facts offered to them. The employees also have regular safety huddles, report errors proactively, and do extensive root cause analyses, which look into the underlying procedures that may have contributed to any error or near miss. One Canadian hospital, St. Joseph's Healthcare in London, Ontario, has decreased medication errors, the wrong meds being given to the wrong individual, and over 800,000 pills delivered in the second quarter of 2016 by using such tactics. Meanwhile, following the same principles, the Golden Valley Memorial in Missouri has reduced drug-resistant Staphylococcus aureus infections to nil. In patient falls, a major source of avoidable harm in hospitals, have decreased by 41%. Despite the added obligations, employees in mindful organizations frequently thrive on it, with a lower turnover rate than those in institutions that do not impose these procedures. Contrary to popular belief, feeling like you are fully using your thoughts for the greater good, rather than simply going through the motions, is more satisfying. A study on functional stupidity and mindful organizations complement each other in this way, illustrating how our environment may either engage the group brain in contemplation and deep thinking, or dangerously constrict its focus, denying it the benefits of its combined intelligence and expertise. They provide a framework for comprehending the intelligence trap and large-scale evidence-based wisdom. Beyond these broad concepts, the study shows specific practical methods for any organization seeking to reduce mistake. Because our prejudices are sometimes accentuated by emotions of time pressure, Tinsley proposes that employers urge employees to review their choices and ask themselves, would I make the same judgments if I had more time and resources? She also believes that personnel working on high-stakes projects should take regular stop and learn periods, where they may look for near misses and investigate the causes that led to them, an approach that NASA has now implemented. She claims they should implement near-miss reporting systems, with the caveat that if you don't record a near-miss, you will be held responsible. Meanwhile, Spicer suggests include pre-mortems and post-mortems in regular team meetings, as well as hiring a devil's advocate whose job it is to question decisions and seek for faults in their rationale. There's a lot of social psychology that shows it causes people to be slightly unsatisfied, but make better judgments. He also suggests utilizing outside perspectives by inviting secondments from other firms or encouraging employees to shadow employees from other organizations and industries, an approach that can help to eliminate the bias blind spot. The goal is to embrace that feeling of chronic unease, the feeling that there is always a better way to do things. Looking at other studies, companies could benefit from assessments like Keith Stanovich's rationality quotient, which would allow them to screen personnel working on high-risk projects to see if they are more or less vulnerable to bias, and if they require additional training. They might also consider instituting critical thinking programs within the organization. They may also examine the company's culture's perspective, such as whether it promotes talent development or leads people to assume that their abilities are fixed. Employees at 7 Fortune 1000 companies were asked to rate their level of agreement with statements such as, when it comes to being successful, this company seems to believe that people have a certain amount of talent, and they really can't do much to change it, reflecting a collective fixed mindset, where this company genuinely values the development and growth of its employees, reflecting a collective fixed mindset. Companies that cultivated a collective growth attitude had more creativity and productivity, better team collaboration, and stronger employee commitment. As one might expect, employees were also less likely to cut corners or cheat to get an advantage. They were less prone to hide their apparent flaws since they knew their growth would be encouraged. Organizations could use productive conflict and desirable problems in their corporate training to ensure that their staff process material more deeply. As we saw in Chapter 8, this not only improves recollection of the content, but it also improves general engagement with the underlying concepts and makes the teachings more easily transferable to other contexts. Finally, the secrets of making sensible decisions for an organization are comparable to the secrets of making wise decisions for an intelligent individual. Whether you're a forensic scientist, a doctor, a student, a teacher, a financier, or an aeronautical engineer, it pays to be humble about your limitations and the possibility of failure, to account for ambiguity and uncertainty, to remain curious and open to new information, to recognize the opportunity to learn from mistakes, and to actively question everything. One recommendation stands out in the Presidential Commission's devastating report on the Deepwater Horizon accident, inspired by a revolutionary reform in U.S. nuclear power plants as a paradigm for how a company might deal with risk more deliberately. The catalyst, as you might assume, was a genuine crisis. Everyone waits to be punished before acting. According to Roberts, the partial meltdown of a radioactive core at the 3 Mile Island Nuclear Generating Station in 1979 was the catalyst in this case. The tragedy prompted the creation of a new regulatory body, the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations, INPO, which has a number of distinguishing features. Every 2 years, a team of inspectors pays a visit to each generator, which lasts 5 to 6 weeks. Although 1/3 of INPO's inspectors are permanent employees, the bulk are seconded from other power plants, resulting in increased knowledge sharing and the regular addition of a fresh perspective to each firm. With regular review groups, INPO actively fosters dialogue between lower-level staff and top management. This guarantees that every level of the hierarchy is aware of and understands the finer points and challenges of day-to-day operations. According to one CEO referenced in the Presidential Commission's report, the results of the inspections are announced at an annual dinner to promote accountability, which means that you get the whole top echelon of the utility industry focused on the bad performance. CEOs in the room frequently offer to lend their experience to help other generators get up to speed. As a result, each organization is continually learning from the mistakes of the others. Since INPO began operations, the number of worker injuries has decreased tenfold in U.S. generators. You don't have to be a supporter of nuclear power to realize how these frameworks maximize the collective intelligence of industry employees and dramatically raise each individual's awareness of potential risks, all while decreasing the accumulation of minor, unnoticed errors that might lead to disaster. INPO demonstrates how regulatory authorities can assist in the spread of mindful cultures across organizations, connecting thousands of people in their critical thinking and reflection. Although the oil industry has yet to establish a system as complex as this, energy corporations have come together to modify industry standards, increase worker training and education, and modernize their technology in order to better control a leak if one occurs. BP has also funded a massive research program to address the Gulf of Mexico's environmental catastrophe. There have been some lessons learned, but at what cost? The intelligence trap is frequently caused by an inability to look beyond our expectations, to envisage a different world in which our conclusion is incorrect rather than correct. This had to be the case on April 20th, 2010. Since no one could have anticipated the magnitude of the disaster they were unleashing. The oil slick would cover more than 112,000 km, 2 of the ocean's surface, over the next few months, an area about 85% the size of England. The calamity, according to the Center for Biological Diversity, killed at least 80,000 birds, 6,000 sea turtles, and 26,000 marine mammals. destroying an ecosystem that could have been avoided due to the deleterious consequences of the oil leaking into the sea and their parents' poor health. Newborn dolphins were still being born with underdeveloped lungs 5 years later. Only 20% of dolphin pregnancies resulted in a healthy baby. That's not even taking into account the massive human cost, aside from the 11 lives lost on the rig, and the terrible agony suffered by those who managed to flee. The leak wreaked havoc on Gulf fishing towns. Darla Rooks, a lifelong fisherwoman from Port Sulphur, Louisiana, described finding crabs with holes in their shells with all the points burned off so all the spikes on their shells and claws are gone, misshapen shells, and crabs that are dying from within. They are still alive, but they smell like they've been dead for a week 2 years after the spill. Over the next few months, the degree of depression in the area increased by 25%, and many towns struggled to recover from their losses. In 2012, Rooks told Al Jazeera, "Think about losing everything that makes you joyful, because that is exactly what happens when someone spills oil and sprays dispersants on it. People who reside here are well aware that they should not swim in or eat anything that originates from our waters. This calamity may have been avoided totally if BP and its partners had recognized the human brain's fallibility and capacity for error. No one is immune, and the dark stain in the Gulf of Mexico should serve as a daily reminder of the intelligence trap's potentially catastrophic potential." Epilogue. We started our voyage with Carrie Mullies, a bright chemist who dabbled in astrology and astral projection, and even backed AIDS denial. It should now be evident how elements like motivated reasoning led him to disregard every warning indication. But, hopefully, it is evident that the intelligence trap is much more than a story about one person's blunders, given the kind of thinking that we, as a culture, have come to value in those that we have overlooked. The trap is a phenomenon that we should all be concerned about. While interviewing so many smart scientists for this book, I noticed that each expert seemed to represent the intelligence or thinking that they were studying in some manner. Igor Grossman was extremely humble and took extra care to emphasize the limits of his knowledge. And Susan Engel was animated with endless curiosity. David Perkins was unusually thoughtful, pausing our conversation frequently to reflect before we continued. Robert Sternberg, on the other hand, was tremendously pragmatic in conveying his message. Igor Grossman was extremely humble and took extra care to emphasize the limits of his knowledge. And Susan Engel was animated with endless curiosity. Perhaps they were drawn to their profession because they wanted to better understand themselves. Or perhaps their own thinking began to mirror the subject of their research. In any case, it served as another example of the vast array of possible thinking styles open to us, as well as the benefits they provide. The rise in IQ over the 20th century is referred to by James Flynn as our cognitive history, as it demonstrates how civilization has shaped our minds. But it seemed to me that our cognitive history may have been very different if each of these scientists had been allowed to present and promote their work in the early 19th century, before the concept of general intelligence started to define the style of thinking that was considered smart. As it stands, our view of intelligence is still dominated by the abstract reasoning measured by IQ tests, SATs, and GREs. To acknowledge that alternative modes of reasoning and learning are equally deserving of our attention, we don't have to dismiss the significance of those abilities or forego the acquisition of factual knowledge and expertise. Indeed, if there's one thing I've taken away from this study, it's that fostering these other characteristics typically improves the skills evaluated by standard cognitive ability tests, as well as making us more rounded and wiser thinkers. Encourage people to define their own problems, examine multiple perspectives, envisage alternate outcomes to events, and detect erroneous arguments, according to study after study, can enhance their general capacity to learn new material while also fostering a better method of reasoning. Learning using these strategies generally benefits people of all intelligence levels, which I found extremely heartening. They can, for example, diminish motivated reasoning in highly brilliant people while also improving general learning in people with lower intelligence. For example, intellectual humility was found to predict academic accomplishment better than an IQ test in a research by Bradley Owens at the State University of New York in Buffalo. Everyone who had a higher level of intellectual humility did better, but those with lower intelligence benefited the most, as it entirely compensated for their inferior natural ability. Evidence-based wisdom principles can assist anyone in realizing their full potential. This new knowledge of human reasoning and thought could not have arrived at a better moment. A high gain in IQ has purchased us, as a society, much less than anyone had any right to aspire for, observed Robert Sternberg in 2018. People nowadays are probably better at deciphering complicated cell phones and other technological breakthroughs than they were at the turn of the century. But are you impressed with what 30 points has brought us in terms of our collective behavior? Despite progress in areas such as technology and healthcare, we are no closer to resolving pressing issues such as climate change or social inequality, and the increasingly dogmatic views that often accompany the intelligence trap only serve to obstruct negotiations between people with opposing viewpoints that could lead to a solution. Increased political polarization and the spread of misinformation in digital wildfires, according to the World Economic Forum, are two of the greatest challenges confronting us today, on par with terrorism and cyber warfare. Complex challenges in the 21st century necessitate a wiser approach to reasoning, one that recognizes our existing limitations, tolerates ambiguity and uncertainty, balances numerous perspectives, and connects disparate areas of expertise. And it's becoming evident that we need more people who exemplify those characteristics. This may sound like wishful thinking, but keep in mind that presidents who scored higher on open-mindedness and perspective-taking scales were considerably more likely to discover peaceful conflict resolutions. Given this data, it's not unreasonable to wonder if, in addition to more obvious metrics of academic performance and professional success, we should be actively demanding those attributes in our leaders. If you wish to apply this research to your own situation, the first step is to recognize the issue. We've seen how intellectual humility can help us look past our biases, establish more reasoned ideas, avoid disinformation, learn more effectively, and collaborate more effectively with others. We typically spend a lot of time attempting to enhance our self-esteem and confidence. As philosopher Valery Tiberius, who is now working with psychologists at the Chicago Center for Practical Wisdom, reminds out. However, I believe that if more individuals were humble about what they know and don't know, it would go a long way toward improving everyone's lives. To that purpose, I've provided a brief taxonomy of definitions in the appendix, highlighting the most common flaws at the heart of the intelligence trap, as well as some of the best strategies to avoid them. Simply being able to put a title on your thoughts can sometimes lead to a more enlightened frame of mind. I've discovered that challenging your own intelligence in this way can be a thrilling experience, as you rethink many of the assumptions you've always taken for granted. It allows you to rediscover the same sense of wonder that fueled everyone from Benjamin Franklin to Richard Feynman as a child. As adults, it's tempting to believe that by the time we complete school, we've hit our intellectual peak. Indeed, we're generally taught to expect a mental decline soon after. Evidence-based wisdom research, on the other hand, reveals that we can all learn new ways of thinking. We may all benefit from wielding our thoughts with clarity, precision, and humility, regardless of our age or expertise, whether a NASA scientist or a school kid.